Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video I have got a tutorial for you. I want to show you how I use the Quiltsmart grid interfacing system to make a patchwork postage stamp quilt. I love these postage stamp quilts, and I've seen them all over the place, but I'll be honest with you, every time I've seen one, they've not been done in fabrics that really appealed to me, so I didn't love them. But I had a ridiculous amount of leftover fabric from the Love Note line that I used for the Rose and Bloom Block of the Month from Fat Quarter Shop. If you've never done a Block of the Month with Fat Quarter Shop before, let me just tell you, they give you a generous amount of fabric. Out of all the fabric that came from that Block of the Month, I made the quilt that was intended to be made, plus this other one that I'm showing you right now. So we're going to get right into the tutorial, and I'm going to show you how this interfacing works. So this is the 1.5 inch pixel grid from Quiltsmart. There are other products out on the market just like this one. They all do basically the same thing. This is just the one that I happen to have. What this means, because it's 1.5 inches, it means that the squares that are drawn on the panel, the interfacing, are 1.5 inches. However, once I take my 1/4 inch seam all the way around, the squares are going to finish at 1 inch. There's going to be 252 pieces of fabric on every single one of these panels to make my quilt. I'm going to use this to sew all of my squares together, but I want to walk you through what that process looks like. The first thing that you need to do is take your panel. You want to lay it out on a flat surface. I've already kind of done that here, so I'm just going to work with this area to show you what to do. You want to lay the panel out on a flat surface where the entire thing can be spread out. Then you're going to come in with your squares and lay them out in a manner that's pleasing to you. I'm going to show you the back side of this. As you're laying it out, you're going to see these dotted lines. That's how you know where to place your square. You're going to want to center it in that square, but don't be too finicky about it. You just want to make sure that the square overlaps with those 1/4 inch marks that are coming into that square area. That's because when you go to sew your seam, you want to make sure that there's some fabric there for your thread to grab a hold of. Once you have all of your squares laid out in a manner that is pleasing to your eye, then you're going to come in with a hot, really hot, dry iron, and you're going to press, not iron. Remember, when we're pressing, we're picking up the iron and then setting it down and just letting it stay on that spot that we're pressing. I actually have noticed that some of these are very, very loose, and I don't want anything to come undone while I'm sewing this. So I'm just taking a minute to re-iron this panel and just make sure that all of that glue is nice and melted down and holding on to my fabrics. And speaking of glue, I am sure some of you out there are asking, doesn't the glue gunk up your iron? My answer to that is no. I've not really noticed that there's much glue that gets onto my iron from this process, and that might be because there's not a lot of the interfacing that's really exposed to my iron. However, if you are worried about something like that, you can always use a pressing cloth, and they make wonderful iron cleaners that will help get any residue off of the sole plate of your iron. Once you're ready to sew your panel together, you'll find that this folds really easily. You're just going to fold one entire row over onto the other. You don't have to worry about creasing it or anything. Then you're going to take it over to the sewing machine, and this is where those little 1/4 inch marks are going to come in really handy. Of course, I can always use a seam guide to help keep me nice and straight, but realistically, I just need to make sure that my needle is hitting right at the tip of all of these dashed lines all the way down. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch away from the fold. And if I'm doing this right, like I said, my needle should be hitting right at the top of those lines. I'm going to use a 2.0 stitch length. The most important thing here is that you are going nice and straight and you're keeping the needle lined up with those 1/4 inch marks. When that's done, we'll bring it back over and open it up. And if the glue is holding onto those squares like it should be, none of them should be flopped over. We just want to make sure that everything looks good, and then we're going to crease it between the next 2 rows. Keep this pulled out of the way. That's why I opened it up. I opened it up and then folded it over so that I don't stitch this piece down. We're going to stitch all along this side and keep doing that the entire width of the panel. I have taken all of the seams going in this direction, but they're not sewn together going in this direction. And I want to point out something. When I took this to the sewing machine and told you you just had to fold and you wanted to stitch along and make sure that your seam was hitting right at the top of these lines, I forgot to mention, though I would hope that you figured it out, you should be folding on that dotted line. If you laid out your fabric the right way, the interfacing should naturally just crease right there. So once that's done, then you're ready to move on to the next step. Now this is where you can deviate a little bit. I've seen some folks take a rotary cutter and ruler and just come in here and slice off the end of all of this. And then they take the time to press these seams open. Now that does reduce the bulk in your seams because, quite honestly, it's going to be a little bulkier than it normally would be with a 4-patch. But what I have found is this lightweight fusible interfacing is so lightweight and finicky that it really just makes pressing the seams open a very long and arduous process, and it gets really finicky and this all gets bunched up and it's not worth the time. So what I actually like to do is grab a pair of snips and I'm just going to snip into these seams. So everywhere where you have those dotted lines in between your squares, you're going to take a small pair of scissors and just snip right up to where your stitching line is. This goes really quickly, a lot faster than it would if you were using a rotary cutter and pressing those seams open. And you're going to do that for each of the rows. And oops, I just made a boo-boo. I actually did just clip into my stitching line there. So if that happens to you, just take it back to the sewing machine and stitch right over that again. Usually what I'll do is just lay the tip of my scissors just before the line of thread and then snip away. Now that I've snipped a couple rows, I'm just going to use this as a demonstration to show you what you should be doing. For each of these rows, you're going to press the seams in alternate directions. So this row, we would press in one direction, and because we snipped in between those 2 pieces of fabric, now this little piece of interfacing and seam should be able to go in the opposite direction. So we're going to come through and press these in the opposite direction, and we're going to continue that all throughout. One row will go up, one row will go down, next one will go up, next one will go down. We'll do that throughout the entire thing. And it does get to be a little finicky when you get to the middle of it, but if you just take your time, I promise this is a lot easier than pressing all of these open. Once you've pressed all of your seams in opposite directions, which I have not yet done here, you should find that your seams are nesting nicely. I don't pin or clip, but what I do is use my thumb and forefinger to feel the seam to make sure that everything's bumped up against each other really nice. I'll hold that in place and take it to the sewing machine and stitch all along this side, making sure that I'm feeling each seam along the way as I'm sewing. Let's go over to the sewing machine and I'll show you what that looks like. So I have my first row folded under, and I'm going to start with the bottom seams pointing towards me and the top seams pointing towards the machine. So I'll bring this underneath my needle and I'll start taking a few stitches, and same thing as before, I want to make sure that my needle is pointed right at the end of those lines. I'll stitch until the needle is in that seam, or it's at least under the presser foot. And then I'll just quickly put my finger underneath the bottom of this to make sure the seam on the bottom is coming towards me. And I'm just going to repeat that action all the way down. I will admit, when the seams on the bottom are pointed towards you, the machine naturally kind of, just because the way the fabric flows into the machine, I feel like that seam automatically kind of gets pushed down towards you. But it's a good habit to get into, to just kind of put your finger down there and flick it back. The beauty of using this panel is your seams should nest without having to mess with anything, but you can feel if there's a gap when you're doing this. So just kind of double check from the top to make sure that your seams are really nicely nested. And now that row is all done. I'm going to repeat that all the way across, and when it's done, we'll give this a nice press and add it to the pile of other finished panels. Once all of your squares are sewn onto your panel, you may notice some curling along the sides. I find that it can curl in along the edge wherever that last seam was taken. So I did the long seams last, so the long edges are kind of curling in a little bit. Now, sometimes this can be pretty exaggerated. This is not an extreme case. I've seen worse, but I still want this to lay flat. So the next step is going to be to give this a really good press, and I do this in 2 steps. I want to press the back side as well as the front side. So to kick things off, we're going to flip this panel over and we're going to press the back side. Now what I'm looking for here is to try to convince all of these long seams to go in one direction. It's just easier to do it that way. I'm not worrying about making everything lay ultra flat from the backside. I'm just trying to convince the seams to kind of go over to the side so that when I start it from the front, they'll cooperate a little bit better. Once we've tamed the seams on the back, we're going to press from the front just like we would any other quilt block. At this point, I'm going to introduce a healthy dose of best press, but you can use Stay Flow, you could use flatter, you could use steam, whatever works for you. And I'm just going to give it that nice final press to get this to lay super, super flat. Now, you may have a few areas where seams are a little bulky, as I have here, and in those cases, I like to use a clapper to lay on top of that bulk to help that seam cool in an ultra flat position. You could use this for the entire panel if you wanted to. I don't think it's necessary, but I do think a clapper along the edges of the panel is particularly helpful. Now that all of these panels are laying flat, it's time to sew them together to make our quilt. Now, I had enough fabric to make 12 panels. I do have some fabric left over, so there was a lot of extra fabric in that block of the month kit. This is honestly the finickiest part of the entire project, but realistically, it is totally doable. Just take it slow and be patient. Each of these panels measures 12 inches across by 21 inches up and down. So I've decided for my configuration, I'm going to make my panels go 4 across. So the short edges are at the top and the long edges are at the side. And I'll have 4 across and 3 down. So 3 rows of 4. 3 times 4 is 12. That's how I got my 12. I can do math. So to join them together, what we're going to do, I'm going to pull out a panel I've already started on. We're going to take 2 panels and lay them out side by side. And I'm going to show you right here. Sometimes our fabrics are going to be exactly the same when we touch, and that's okay. That's part of our scrappiness. Sometimes those seams won't be exactly perfect in some areas, but it might be absolutely perfect in others. And we're not going to worry about this either, because by the time the quilt is quilted and washed and crinkles up, I don't think we're going to notice this area of the quilt. There's so much going on visually that you probably wouldn't have noticed it had I not just drawn your eye right to the center of this panel. But we do want to try to make sure that our points are lined up as much as we possibly can. So what we're going to do is grab the panel that we want to attach our next one onto. So if you're starting out, you're just going to grab two, and you're going to lay them right sides together. If you've been around my channel for a minute, you know I'm not a big fan of pinning or sewing, but in this case, it's needed. I've got a healthy dose of some Wonder Clips laying out here in front of me, and I'm going to use those to pin my seams together. Now, I did make a little bit of a boo-boo on the panel that I am joining. Some of these seams are going one way and some of them are going the other way. So that means that I'm going to be able to demonstrate for you how you nest your seams when the seams are going in the same direction and when they're going in opposite directions. I do like to use Wonder Clips for this, by the way, because I feel like the pins are a little too sharp and I really don't want to be poked and prodded and bleed all over my project. So clips are better for this step of the game for me. I start clipping or pinning by working at one end of the quilt. I do the first one and I do the first one at the other end, and then I work my way into the middle, because if I find that there's some excess fabric in one of the two panels, maybe one's a little bit bigger than the other, it's going to evenly distribute that gap or that excess into the seam as I go. On this end, my seams are going in the same direction, so let me show you how I handle that first. My seams are both going off to the left. What I can do is one of two things. Either I can lay the fabrics on top of each other and just carefully manipulate it so that that seam is literally right on top of each other. I want to make sure that my dotted line from both panels is on top of one another and that seam is on top of each other. And then I'll come in and take a clip and hold that in place. The other thing that I can do, if I really so desired, is just change one of the seams so that it's going in the opposite direction. In this case, they are both pointed this way, so if I just take my little finger and just floop, oh, look at that. Now the top is going off to the right and the bottom is going off to the left, and that's going to allow me to put the seams together and feel with my thumb and my forefinger if the seams are nested. And I feel like they are, so now I'm going to grab a clip and hold that together. If I choose to do that method, the only impact here is my seam on the back side of my quilt that nobody's ever going to see is now twisted. With a good amount of pressing, you can get that to lay super, super flat and nobody's ever going to know. If you're hand quilting this, maybe it'll make it a little bit difficult, but any sewing machine that you use to quilt this is going to be able to get through that just fine. If you are worried about that seam being twisted and pressed and folded, you can get rid of the fold with a little pair of snippy snips. I can just come in with my snips, cut into that seam allowance, be careful not to cut your stitching, and now I can just separate the seams so that they're going in different directions and there's no fold or twist. They're just going in different directions. The integrity of the quilt is not jeopardized by this, and maybe that would make it easier if you were hand quilting. So I've got one seam at this end clipped. I'm going to clip one seam at this end. Now these are already going in opposite directions, so feeling them nesting should be a bit easier. I'm going to line up my dotted lines on both panels, clip those seams into place, and I can tell already that this top panel is just a little bit bigger than the one underneath. So as I work each of those seams and clip them into place, it should evenly distribute that excess throughout the entire seam length. I will say if I were doing this on a border or a seam where I didn't have the panel, I would have found center pinned there and then found the edges pinned or clipped on either of the edges and then distributed the bolt from the center out to each of those edges. However, I've got this panel which has everything marked, and that's why I just did either end and worked my way into the middle. Once our panels are clipped together, we're going to sew this 1/4 inch away from that dotted line. Remember, the guide that we had before is just making sure that our needle is hitting right at those 1/4 inch dashed marks all along the way. And then, of course, we're just going to make sure that we continue to feel the seams laid out where they should be. Make sure they're butted up next to each other or laying on top of each other, whatever case may be for you. And then we're going to go all the way along our seam. And then we have our panels joined together. I'm going to continue this until I have 3 rows of 4 that are all joined right along that long edge, and I'll put them together and make my quilt. This is really easy, right? It makes intricate piecing a breeze. Those points look amazing, and I couldn't be more impressed with the finish of this quilt. Let me know in the comments down below if this is a notion that you have tried before or if you're going to try it, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!